Thank you, Mr Tuckett, for coming in today. You will know that the Home Affairs Select Committee has a duty to carry out pre-appointment hearings, and this is the first one we're doing as the new committee, so bear with us if we ask repetitive questions or anything like that. We are finding our feet as much as anyone else. But I just wanted to kick off with why do you want the job?
Well, good afternoon, Chair, and good afternoon to everybody. Why do I want the job? Firstly, there are three reasons. The first one is I see this as a unique opportunity to make a difference, to be a catalyst for change in one of the most sensitive and important areas of the country at the moment. We're all aware of the concerns about immigration. Public concerns have probably never been higher. Some would say that the trust and confidence in the whole system has probably never been lower. So this role, I think, is a vital part to play in improving the efficiency and effectiveness of the borders and immigration system, and restoring that trust and confidence in some degree. And the scale of that challenge I just find very, very motivating for myself personally. The second reason is there's a huge intellectual challenge associated with this role, and I may be a bit of a masochist, but in my previous roles I seem to have really relished taking on big scenarios and distilling them down into bite-sized chunks and then developing workable solutions. And I think that's what this role is in a nutshell. It's a huge agenda across border security, immigration enforcement, visas, immigration.
I knew if I started that we would have this carried to us. I do apologise, but we will have to suspend the sitting. We'll suspend for 15 minutes. If there are more than one vote, it may be slightly longer, but I'm very, very sorry about this. Order. Apologies for the interruption. Mr. Tuckett, you'd been describing why you want to have the job, so I guess we can follow up with what qualifies you for the role.
I think my qualifications are based on the experience that I have and the skills that I have. And the experience falls into three main categories. I've been in major leadership roles as a chief executive or leading major change programs across a very, very wide range of contexts within the public sector for over 20 years. And that's given me a very, very significant belt, as it were, of leadership experience in different contexts. I know what it's like to be a chief executive in the public sector. I know what it's like to not only be inspected, but also the kind of challenges that the leaders in the borders and immigration systems will face. And I would guess that I've probably seen most of the situations in some shape or form that they are experiencing somewhere in the 20 years experience that I've got. Secondly, I've led many reviews and inspections myself when I worked as part of the Treasury in some of the most complex and sensitive big programs that government had at that time. So as it were, I'm well acquainted with the model of inspections, well acquainted with how challenging they can be for people who you are inspecting or reviewing at the time, and I know what works and doesn't work. And I think that the experience as both of a chief executive and also in leading reviews, I have a real good understanding of what works when it comes to organisational transformation and change, and when you're trying to take a system or an organisation through some form of change, whether that's an improvement or a major structural change. And finally, again, as a result of all the different contexts I've worked in, I think I have a very good amount of stakeholder engagement experience. And I've worked with a huge range of stakeholders, from end users, be those patients or fishermen, through to service providers, be they nurses, doctors, be they immigration advisors, through to regulators, through to managers, through to directors, civil service at the highest levels, and ministers as well. So I've got that range of expertise, and I think I'm in a good position to engage with the huge multitude of stakeholders that the borders and immigration system has in its own way. So those are the three batches of experience that I think most suit me from this role.
And do you think there'll be new challenges?
Oh yes, there always are. But the contexts will be different. What I have found is that often, whilst it might appear to be a different issue, when you get into it, often it's the same old things are reappearing many, many different times. But that's not to say you don't get surprised that sometimes you do, yes.
Thank you. Belle Ribeiro-Addy.
Thank you, Chair. You talked about your work with government before. Could you tell us a bit more about your experience working directly with ministers and senior officials, in particular any times where you've had to manage challenging relationships?
I think the first one would be in the job I'm in at the moment, which is now the Immigration Advice Authority. When I joined it, and it was the Office of the Immigration Service Commissioners, the distance between it and the Home Office was legion. The two were hardly talking with each other, and the Home Office was hardly aware of what the office was doing, and equally there was no contact between the office or the Home Office, or only at a minimal level. Now, in all the workings I've had with government, that kind of relationship is not the most profitable or useful. So over the 5 years, I've worked very, very hard to bring the work of the OISC to the attention of ministers and senior officials within the Home Office, and that's meant a lot of briefings at personal level, a lot of pushing at doors to get access to see senior officials and ministers, and being prepared to say what the organisation was doing and how they could help and how we could help their agenda at the same time. I think immigration advice was initially seen as a sort of, I sometimes describe it as a Cinderella service, something that was sort of out there and everyone just let it be out there. I think one of the successes I have managed to achieve with ministers of the previous government and with this current government and with Home Office officials is to see immigration advice as an integral part of the immigration system. And if you have a good, robust, thriving advice sector, the benefits for the wider immigration system are very considerable indeed.
And have you had to manage any other challenging relationships in your previous roles? I suppose you've talked about what you've been doing at the moment, but in your previous contact, any challenging relationships with senior ministers or...
Yes, when I was working as the Chief Executive of the Marine Management Organisation, I was regularly meeting with the Minister for Fisheries and the Environment Minister, who at that time were George Eustace and Therese Coffey. I then ran a major review of DEFRA's transformation programme and was working with the Secretary of State, who at the time was Liz Truss, and regularly meeting with them and briefing them all on where things were going and how I saw things could improve moving forward.
Thank you. And do you have, or do you believe you have the experience to ensure that as the ICIBI, that you understand, engage with the experiences of people that are actually going through the immigration system? So these could be vulnerable people, such as people seeking asylum or the victims of modern slavery. And how would you go about doing this?
They're a group of stakeholders who it's vital for the ICIBI to have contact with, either directly or through representative bodies. Now, there are many representative bodies like, for example, Refugee Action, who will be able to speak on behalf of the individual asylum seekers or visa applicants, whatever it is. That's not to say, though, that if one can get to the individual end user, their experiences are very important to get a feel for. Now, for someone like an applicant for a visa, that's much easier than, let's say, a refugee or an asylum seeker, someone who, for example, has come across illegally in a boat but nevertheless it's quite feasible to do it, and as ICIBI I would be, one of the first things I could do would be getting out to establishments where these individuals are to meet them face to face as well as meeting the officials.
Thank you. Paul.
Thank you. Your answers sounded wonderfully collaborative, and that's of course important, but this is an independent role and you're there to challenge government and the Home Office on very controversial issues. What experience have you had of being independent from the system and challenging the system?
In that sense, the role I did in the Treasury in leading reviews of major programmes and projects was exactly that. You put together a small team, you were the team leader, you went in as an independent team and as an independent team leader, but at the same time you worked with the people who you were reviewing, inspecting, assessing. And one of the ways that I found was very successful was at the start of each review or inspection, you had a session with the people you were going to work with, and you established the ground rules of how you were going to work. And where, as the reviewer being independent, you would be independent, and what that meant in practice, and how you would work through with the people such that they understood, yes, at times this person is going to be independent, but they at the same time are working with us, so that the end result, you get recommendations which are implementable, are workable, and actually will improve the system. That doesn't stop in any way myself as an independent lead reviewer or inspector saying, I've identified this and this doesn't seem to be working. Not at all. You can do that and you must do that. But it's how you then work it through that's important after that.
What if you get pushback?
You discuss it, you talk about it, and you talk further about it. And again, one of the things I've done in the past is that you establish a modus operandi. If we disagree in the course of this review, how are we going to work it? How are we going to resolve it? Who's going to meet with whom? And you go on discussing it until you see whether you can get a resolution. Now, at the end of the day, you may, as the reviewer and in charge of a review or an inspection team, have to say, well, look, this is my finding at the end of the day, this is what I'm going to say. But I hope you don't get to that. And in my experience, if you establish this, what I call a compact, with the people you're reviewing at the start of the process, so you all can know what to expect from each other, then most times you can find a way through without having to resort to saying, well, we agree to disagree totally and utterly, and I'm going to take this line.
Talking about these are controversial issues, in your experience when you were Secretary to the Archbishop of York during a controversial time with the safeguarding issues, what did you learn from that experience?
Well, that was probably the most challenging stakeholder engagement experience of my life. for 3 years, working with the Archbishop and bishops and those 3 dioceses who were being brought together into a single entity. And it was vital in that particular role to spend a lot of my time going on one-to-one conversations, discussions with people to understand where they were coming from, why they were concerned. One of the learnings that I took from that particular project was that right from the outset, the case for change had not been properly made. So when I arrived, there were a lot of people still saying, why are we doing this? We don't understand. And so we had to formulate what the case for change was and restate it as part of then working with individuals, often on a one-to-one basis.
But ultimately your boss didn't accept that?
No, he did. The whole proposal was approved by the General Synod.
Oh no, but the Archbishop of York, I mean.
Well, the Archbishop of York was fully in favour of it.
He did, okay, but he didn't accept the findings.
No, this was nothing to do with safeguarding at all. We had no safeguarding issues during the time I was working with the Archbishop of York. This was John Sentamu when he was the Archbishop. This was purely about how did you bring together 3 dioceses and make them into a single entity after that. The issue with safeguarding didn't rear its head during my time there.
Okay, thank you.
Chris Murray.
Thank you. Could I ask a little bit about the context in which the ICIBI operates and the sort of wider immigration and border security challenges that the Home Office faces? So what would you say are the greatest risks that the Home Office faces right now? Firstly on immigration and then secondly on border security.
Well, if I can phrase my answer to that one, saying I'm not in yet with the detailed knowledge of the system. So the perspective I bring at the moment is from an outsider's perspective. And whilst my current role is to do with immigration advice, it's not into the mainstream of immigration business. However, having said that, I think if one takes lawful immigration, first of all, there are some big challenges for the Home Office associated with electronic visas, which are coming in as we speak at the moment. And also, if one looks at the other border issues coming down the line, when the European Union starts introducing ETIAS and other electronic forms of verification of people as they cross the border, there's, I think, going to be challenges for all countries with potential worse delays at the borders trying to get through. I think in that area of what I would call lawful migration, including visas, sort of servicing and processing, we have a lot of people who were migrants shortly after Brexit who may well be now applying for indefinite leave to remain. And those numbers could be well into the hundreds if all of them were to do so. That is going to provide processing challenges for the Home Office looking further down the line. And of course, there's always the asylum backlog, which is there at the moment, which is probably the most pressing of all the servicing areas that the system faces. In terms of the border itself, and you asked about the border and the border security, well, I think part of it is covered by what I've already said, the potential challenges with electronic verification of identity, both to enter the country and to leave the country, and the kind of checks that have to be done with people as that comes in. I think that will be challenging for the system as a whole to bring in smoothly without huge disruption and huge delays. In terms of border security itself, I'd like to come, if I'm assuming I am in this role, I'd like to come back in a few months' time to talk to this committee more about border security. But the sort of confidential areas of border security I'm not up to speed with at the moment.
Would you say that the role of the ICIBI is... Oh, sorry. Was that me? Apologies. The role of the ICIBI is to measure and inspect the operational functionality of the Home Office, or is it also to measure the gap between the perception, but between the political objectives and what we're being told the Home Office will achieve, and the reality on the ground. Another way of putting that question would be to ask, do you think your role is to kick the tyres on whether the public can properly trust what the Home Office is telling them they're doing?
I think the role of the ICIBI is to look at the functions that the Borders and Immigration System is carrying out and to see whether they are, firstly, delivering on government policy for which these functions have been established, and whether the functions are being carried out efficiently and effectively to deliver on that policy. There's a bit of both elements, I think, of your question, if I've understood it correctly, about seeing how the policy is actually working in practice and advising if it's not, or what needs to be done to make it work in practice, and then looking at whether the processes are being done efficiently and effectively to the benefit of end users, to the benefit of those who are actually using the services.
When you say to the benefit of end users, what role do you think the ICIBI has in ensuring that migrants' rights are properly protected and that the Home Office is treating people appropriately and fairly?
I think that depends upon how the Home Office prioritises migrant rights. I can look at any process and tell you whether it's working efficiently or effectively, but one of the things I do look at is what are the priorities for that process and what are its ultimate aims that it's trying to achieve. And if one of the ultimate aims is, yes, migrants' rights must be absolutely top of the list, then as ICIBI, I will go in and say, right, where are we, how are you protecting migrants' rights, how are you honouring migrants' rights? So there's an element here about where the migrants' rights, as it were, is articulated in the priorities for the processes.
You wouldn't, for example, if it hadn't been very clearly articulated by the Home Office at the outset of a new process, you wouldn't think it was implicit in your job description to consider, could this turn into another Windrush?
Oh, yes, most certainly.
But that's not what you just said.
No. I would know, if I saw it had been ignored and I felt that this was something that should have been taken into account, then I would draw the attention to that and say, yes, there is a gap here. You haven't taken account of migrant rights in defining. You may have an excellent process for delivering XYZ, but if XYZ doesn't include migrants' rights, for example, then I would say, I think you should be thinking about migrants' rights to include that with XYZ. Now let's see how your processes will deliver on migrants' rights.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so imagine you are in the role and you've got a year ahead of you and limited resources. The work of the Home Office is vast. I mean, the programmes that you've just talked about are huge ones. How would you go about designing a programme of work to maximise the impact of your office?
First thing I would do is get myself up to speed with a much more in-depth knowledge on the big picture side of all of borders and immigration. Now that's just an education thing, and I do that by going out, visiting people, talking with leaders and talking with stakeholder groups and end users, etc., etc. When it comes to defining a programme, I think you have to start segmenting this vast arena. Now, I know that the current incumbent uses a methodology of looking at border security on the one hand, looking at visa processing and asylum processing on another, and looking at immigration enforcement as another, and looking at, I think, learning opportunities as another. And he's got that way. I think I would like to explore that further to see whether I can build on that, because that does seem a sensible way of doing an initial segmentation. And then once you've got that segmentation, you can take each one of those in turn and then start breaking it down. Now, the challenge here is how do you decide where can you get the most impact for the least input? The agenda is vast, and one could spend a lot of time looking at a lot of processes and coming up with a lot of recommendations that actually it might not have that major impact overall. And I think the real skill is identifying where can you have the most impact.
How are you judging impact? Because impact could be your recommendations are accepted by the Home Office and they change policy, or impact could be the national debate about immigration is affected and you get press coverage and you start shaping it, or it could be the lives of the actual people who are affected by the policy are altered in some way. How would you distinguish between those three? and prioritise between them?
Well, I think there's one that you haven't mentioned, which is what's laid down in statute to raise the efficiency and the effectiveness and the consistency of processes. Now, you can measure effectiveness and you can measure efficiency of processes quite easily. And in some respects, the actual aim of the statute is efficiency, effectiveness, and consistency. Now, when it comes back to what I was saying earlier, it depends how a process has defined its other priorities, which are all the other things that you mentioned. So I think you can measure efficiency, effectiveness, and consistency. They're parameters which are relatively easy to measure. Other ones are more challenging.
When you say about processes, what process challenges do you think the Home Office currently has? And do you think the Home Office is in the market for improving those processes?
From everything I've been told from the Home Secretary through Permanent Secretary and officials, there's a general recognition that there are processes which could certainly be improved and that there are areas which need to be improved.
My question wasn't, is there a recognition? My question is there an appetite? Because I don't think the Home Office has struggled to recognise its failures of processes in the past. It just hasn't been willing to do anything about them. And so my question for you is, do you also recognise that?
I would not be sitting here in front of you if I had not received assurances from the highest levels of the people I've spoken with the Home Office that they were determined to get to grips with making the processes better.
Would you say the Home Office wants transformational change, and why would you? How do you evidence that?
The Home Office is a huge organisation in its own right, and I think to think of it as a single entity is I think it becomes almost too big. Even Borders and Immigration is not a single entity in its own right. There are three very, very different chunks, if you like. There's border security, immigration enforcement, visas and immigration on the other side. Are they up for transformation? I think there is a growing recognition that things need to change. I haven't yet got sufficiently into the job to be able to evidence that to you now. Again, I would very much welcome coming back in 6 months' time and giving you my experience then. But from what I would not have put in for this job unless I thought, at least at the very top, there was top-level support for actually making a change, doing things differently, and getting things better in the areas where it's appropriate to do so.
Thank you. Just going back to that point and what you've just said. So as far as you're concerned, you have got the job?
No, I'm not. I'm not at all. I appreciate that it is this committee for you to approve my nomination as the preferred candidate.
Do you think it's strange that the Home Office has already listed you on their website as being the preferred candidate in an article?
I mean, as I understand it, this is the sort of standard procedure that the Home Office has gone through with previous incumbents, that at this stage they announce who is the preferred candidate.
Okay. And just thinking of some of the process and things you might have to look into, one of them would be immigration detention. And the immigration detention estate is one of the ones that's probably the most prioritised parts of the Home Office. Contracts worth millions of pounds. So I was wondering if you had any links, current or previous, to any of the major contractors, such as Serco, G4S, My Time, Mears, or Clear Springs Ready Homes.
I've personally had no contact with organisations of that nature, certainly not with anything to do with immigration detention. And that is, of course, an area as well where there are overlaps with other chief inspectors, with prisons and also for constabulary. So it's a very complex area, but I appreciate it's a very important one.
Thank you.
You've talked a lot about areas where the Home Office might have an appetite for seeking improvements. How are you going to shine a light on those areas that the Home Office don't want to look at?
By being bold and courageous and saying, I think you should be looking at these areas. And I'd like to think that I'm experienced enough and confident enough in my own judgment. I wouldn't say ugly enough, but I would say I feel quite ready to say to a minister or to say to a permanent secretary or ever, this area is not working, you should be looking at this area.
Would you say it publicly?
That would depend. It depends. I think there is a public accountability side for this role. And as I said right at the start of this, the public concern about immigration is so vast at the moment that I think to deny that there's any form of a public accountability aspect to this role would be a mistake. Now, how one exercises that public accountability, that is another matter. I think the way you phrased the question sort of implied, would I go public on a major issue? I don't think I would initially. I would want to have discussions, first of all, to express my concern, to see what the reaction was. I think, if I may say so, Chair, the way you phrased the question put it rather in the terms of a nuclear option. And I think there are always many, many other options before you have to get to that one.
Thank you. Robbie Moore.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to focus a little bit on investment. So I know that you've previously identified that there's a relatively small resource for the organisation compared to the size of the borders and immigration system at large, and therefore that being identified as an area of risk associated to it. Could you just outline how you would go about making sure that there was the right level of resource available to you and to the priorities that you would be wanting to seek?
I think the first thing I would say is that if we as an inspectorate are looking for efficiency and effectiveness throughout the rest of the Home Office, we have to make sure that our own house is in order and that we as an inspectorate are making the best use of the money that we do have available and are being as efficient and as effective as we can be with what resources we have. In terms of how would I argue for more resources, I would certainly put the case to the powers that be, the financial people within the Home Office, that I think there is a case for expanding the size of the inspectorate. The NAO did a review of all the inspectorates, I think it was about 10 years ago now, and there are some elements of that report that are still very current today. And I think the current inspectorate within Borders and Immigration is on the, what might say, the small side compared with some of the other inspectorates, and given the scale of the Borders and Immigration agenda and the way that it has expanded, I think there is a case, and I will be making that case, for more resource. I'll also be making the case that if you do have more resource and can actually identify more efficiencies, it becomes effectively a spend to save type option. You may be able to save as much as you have to put in to invest into an enhanced inspectorate.
May I just expand on making the case? How would you be as robust as possible? Would you be how would you be prepared to ruffle feathers, so to speak, to make sure that you are heard by the Home Secretary in making that case that more investment should you deem that necessary to come into particular areas? How robust are you going to be in your position of being independent? I've
been very successful in my current role in getting a huge increase in funding without having to ruffle feathers, and I think the. Are
you pushing strong enough?
I think I am for what we're getting at the moment and what we are capable of spending. I think rather than ruffling feathers, the approach I would take is arguing logically. This is the area of work I want to get into. This is the benefit I can see coming out of it. This is the cost that will come out of it. And this is how actually you will save and benefit in the longer term if you invest that money up front. That way, I think, has more chance of success than going in and being, I don't quite know how to put it, but being negative about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I suppose part of the challenge is being nimble enough to make sure that, because as risks change, being nimble enough with your requests and your asks, not only for the level of investment going in, but level of resources going in. So how would you use your role of being that independent chair to put those requests, whether it's to the Perm Sec or to the Home Secretary, to make sure that resource of finance or other resource that may be needing to be nimble enough to the risks that you have identified?
I think what you have to do is prove that you are a credible force. And if you can point to achievements where, for example, in the ICIBI case, you have made recommendations, you've got efficiencies going because recommendations are being implemented and they are delivering, because that's the name of the game, that's what we're here to do, then I think you're on a much stronger ground for then arguing for more resources. To argue for more resources from a current level where you may be delivering something but not a lot is a much weaker case. So my approach is to deliver first, then use that as a platform to argue for more resources, and argue for more resources with specific case for it, what you want, why you want it, how you want it, and what the benefits are going to achieve. Okay,
thank you. And I just want to turn on to a slightly different topic, if that's okay, just sort of working patterns. So, so the appointment is full-time. My understanding is that you're working 3 days a week in the moment in your current role. Just explain how you will move towards the expectations of the demands that are associated with this full-time appointment.
Well, actually, my current current role is 4 days a week,
okay,
and I actually work 5 days a week and spread over the 5-day period. So actually, moving to a 5-day working week is no problem for me at all.
Okay, and again, my understanding is that under your leadership, the Immigration Advisory Authority moved to working fully remotely as a working model. What do you deem as the best balance in terms of working methodology between those that are involved in the organisation? And what balance do you feel, should there need to be any change, would be best suited to this appointment and the organisation?
I think we can probably get into a very long discussion about the pros and cons of remote working. I think remote working works for some organisations, but it's very dependent on the nature of the work, the nature of the geographical coverage of the work, and the nature of the workforce and the individuals within it. Yes, within the IAA, as was the OISC, we moved after the COVID lockdown into a fully remote model. We'd done it for 2 years during COVID. It had worked very well. The lease on our building was running out. I saw no reason to go for another expensive office lease, and actually saved a lot of money that I could then invest in frontline staff. Furthermore, it gave us a geographical coverage across the whole of the United Kingdom, which we had never had before. We'd otherwise been totally focused in London. So we were able to give ourselves an operational impact in ways that we hadn't been able to do before. And we've also found that we've accessed a much greater talent pool than ever before, I think because we are a home working organisation, and so the talent that we've been able to draw in has gone up. So there's been a win-win-win. But that was for the OISC IAA, and for us it was, I think, probably the right thing to do, and has proved right. For ICIBI, it's a totally different thing altogether. I understand half the workforce is based at home and half in an office in London. Quite what the right balance is moving forward, I don't yet know. I need to get in there, understand the working patterns of the organisation to see whether any change or whether that hybrid model working. To answer your question, what is the best balance? I can only go back to what we do in the IAA, where although people are based at home, we bring them together very, very frequently. Every month or so we would have a staff conference, everyone comes together, training is done all together, individual teams come together and they just utilise either government buildings or hire local facilities as a place to actually meet and do the work. And we find, so far, we found it works very well. Staff satisfaction levels and engagement levels have been very, very high indeed. But that's for the IAA.
And,
right.
And if your judgment was, if you're lucky enough to get the new role, was to, and you came to the conclusion that actually the current balance isn't quite right, we need more of the team working more in the office permanently, or whatever the balance that you came to, and that wasn't very well received by the team, so to speak, how would you go about making, or would you then shy away from those decisions in terms of the balance?
Well, as I understand it, all the staff in the inspectorate are civil servants, and they are on civil service terms and conditions of service, and that brings with it its own degrees of regulation and what is possible and what is not possible. In the case of the OISC, we were all public servants, and so we were in a different arena in terms of making changes to contracts and things like that. But people who are on, for example, home-based contracts, to change that is quite a challenge, can be quite a challenge. So I think I would have to get in there, find out the detail and see how the best way forward was.
Okay, thank you very much. And just to move on to...
Can I just come...
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, it's okay. Just... If you found that you needed to be in the office 5 days a week, and that actually because of the working patterns of ministers and the way Parliament works, that actually you simply had to be there 5 days a week, that would be fine?
Yep. Yes, it would be. I mean, I have done this kind of work before, and when I was asked this question at my interview, I said, I think that my judgment is you need time when you're available for ministers, visits, all the things where you need to do face-to-face. You also need time where you can think, sit back, write, because you don't write a report, in 10 spare minutes in between two major appointments. So I think there's a 60-40 split between, for the chief inspector, this is, where you need to spend a bulk of the time available, doing the rounds, as it were, being visible, and then you need dedicated time, wherever, doing that quiet reflection, thinking, and developing plans, programs, whatever it is.
And so you're able to do evening events. I mean, this place, as you know, has very strange hours. So there's no problem at all with travel or anything, doing evening events?
Not necessary.
So you live within commuting distance of the London office?
Right.
You live within commuting distance of the London office?
No, I don't. I have a family home in Finland, and I come across to this country whenever I need to.
You'd be expecting to inspect the UK borders and immigration without being resident in the UK?
No, I work in UK, and I would be in UK. That is why.
Are you resident in the UK?
No, I'm resident in Finland.
Okay.
Can I ask who would be expected to pay for your travel and accommodation?
No, I pay for that myself. I always have done.
Thank you. Robbie?
Just expanding on the questions that have been asked around the ability to challenge ministers and building up that balance of trust with ministers, but being in a position to robustly challenge them. Can you just give us an example of when you have previously put forward a very strong case to a previous employer arrangement that you've been involved with where it hasn't been well received, and you've then elevated that challenge to a position of getting an outcome that you've been satisfied with?
Yes, I would go back to a review that I led in the Department of Work and Pensions, where a minister had, on a major new IT programme, at the last moment changed the implementation date, causing very considerable concern and havoc within the programme. We were going in to do a review of the programme, and the programme director and the SRO, when I arrived, said, we need your help because we think we've got a real problem on our hands, that this has just been changed at the last moment. We did our initial interview, as we always do, with the minister concerned, and it was quite clear he was adamant that he wanted to impose this change upon the system, and it was also quite clear that from a professional programme perspective, this was causing major concern and threatening the ability of the programme to deliver in the longer term. So the question was, how could one, as it were, bring about an understanding of the situation that was acceptable to all parties? The way we did it, in the end of the day, was to ask what level of risk assessment had been provided by officials when the minister's proposal had been under consideration before he took the decision. And our recommendation was that we thought a further risk assessment should be undertaken to see that the minister was properly appraised of all the risks before finalising his decision. And that way we managed, I think, to get a bit of a resolution to the issue.
Bit of a resolution to the issue?
I don't remember whether he actually changed his mind or not, but we certainly got him to think about it.
Okay.
I'm afraid it's quite a long time ago, but
just to pose a scenario to you, that maybe that let's assume you produced a report in the role that you're going for, and then the Home Office decided to maybe delay its publication, or potentially the Home Office decided to redact some of the recommendations or the conclusions or the wording that you had come to, that you felt strongly and passionately about that it should be kept in. But this report was not going to be published until those changes had taken place. How would you respond?
Firstly, if I had set up, as I indicated earlier in this discussion, a compact about how we were going to run an inspection, which would include timings around factual checking and what to do in case anyone wanted to redact. If those issues had been honoured, then I would be content. If they had not been honoured and people were delaying or redacting in a way that was not in line with the compact that we'd agreed, I would raise it, first of all, with the Director General of the area concerned and say, look, this is not in line with what we've agreed with your people. Why? Can we please have an understanding of what's going on here? And if that didn't work, I would escalate it to the Second Permanent Secretary. And if that didn't work, I would escalate it into ministers. And if that didn't work, I would escalate it to the Home Secretary. And I would work up the tree. But I think this is the value of having that agreement or compact right at the outset, that you have established standards that you expect to work to.
Okay, thank you very much. And just finally, you've kindly outlined roles that you've had previously and levels of interaction with various parts of the government, whether it's DWP or the Home Office or other scenarios that you've given, indeed having worked for the Archbishop of York in some form or for another. So, but various public sector facing roles. Would you accept a conclusion that you're just part of the system as it is at the moment, and it's not the fresh thinking that we need in this role?
No, I wouldn't agree with that at all. I think I can bring fresh thinking. I think I bring the fresh thinking because I've got such a variety of backgrounds upon which to draw. And whilst, and I've worked with many people who have come in from the private sector and into the public sector, and they do bring fresh thinking and sometimes bring very, very different thinking. But I like to think I can bring the best of both. I can bring the knowledge of the public sector and the experience of having worked in the public sector, so I know what it's like and I know what's the art of the possible and what's the art of the impossible. And I also bring the freshness of thinking coming from the different areas in which I've worked, which are so very different. The environment around the Church of England is totally different from defence, totally different from health, totally different from immigration. They are totally different.
And part of your CV, have you had a long part of your life working in the private sector?
No, I've never worked in the private sector at all.
Okay,
no.
Thank you.
No.
I'll just ask, before I bring Belle in, so, I mean, you'll be working in an incredibly sensitive field, human beings, but also drugs, potential unlawful behaviour, smuggling, etc. So you go to a seaport and you carry out an inspection, you see something that is clearly, in your view, putting at risk the UK's national security, and you take that to ministers and they don't want to know. What do you do?
I think you have to continue to take it to ministers for as long as you can. If they at the end of the day don't want to do anything about it, that is a minister's prerogative, and there's nothing I can do. If you're asking, would I then go to the press? Would I then go outside? No, I would not. When
the press come to you about it, so
it would depend entirely on the context. I think it is very right that the ICIBI has a form of a public profile, and indeed in all my roles I've always encouraged discussion with the media, because I think if you have good relations with the media and they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, when something does go wrong, you're in a much better position to help mitigate it than if you're coming from a completely, as it were, blank sheet of paper. So it would depend entirely on the circumstances.
But if you'd seen something in an inspection that you had concerns about, you'd taken it to the Home Office hadn't taken action, and then a journalist comes to you having found how do you handle that kind of situation? We're all politicians around this table, so we're always thinking the worst here.
I would play for time. I would not. However, whatever it was, I don't see my role as then betraying the trust of ministers by then saying, well, you haven't taken any notice of me, I'm therefore going to go to the press.
Isn't a key word in your title independent? Yes. And so the public would expect you to act independent of the interests of ministers. And so if you saw something like serious immigration crime or drug offence, drug smuggling through the border, and ministers refused to do anything about that, don't you think it ultimately harms the office of the ICIBI and all your staff who are on the front line inspecting this stuff, if you accept that and don't act independently? And doesn't that also have huge ramifications for public trust in our borders and immigration system?
The independent nature of the ICIBI is defined by a number of things. It's defined in statute. For example, the ICIBI can inspect whatever he or she likes in whatever way they like. At the same time, the ICIBI, there are agreements with the Home Office that, for example, the Home Secretary will publish reports. The ICIBI does not have the right to publish reports in a way that perhaps other inspectors do. So the independence of the role of the ICIBI is a framework which has been set up by the fact that the way the organisation is set up, the way it's funded, the way it's set up, and agreements that exist between the Home Office and that. Now, that's the formal side. What stakeholders expect of the ICIBI may be something different. They may well expect, to take your description of the word independent, they may have expectations that the word independent means something very different. They may have the expectation that independent means you can publish reports whenever you like, but that's not the framework which is in place at the moment. So we have to be, it's managing expectations of stakeholders, and one of the things I would want to do in talking with all the key stakeholder groups on joining, assuming that I have been approved by this committee, would be to get clarification about what their expectation of this word independent means and how they see it manifesting itself.
You need clarification. You accept there's a lack of clarity at the moment. Do you, would you think that operating model that you've just described should also apply to other chief inspectors? For example, when the Chief Inspector of Constabulary saw police brutality, they should get clearance from Home Office ministers before they tell the public.
It's not my place to answer for the other chief inspectors and how they're set up and what their frameworks are and what their agreements are with their parent departments. I don't know. So
you have no view on that?
I couldn't answer that, I'm afraid.
Okay. Belle Riviere-Addy.
Thank you, Chair. Other independent chief inspectors have raised that this issue of the Home Office not implementing their recommendations is a problem, and you've explained why you won't necessarily take certain actions. But could you explain if it is a huge concern to you as well?
Yes, it is, because I think if at the end of the day, the aim is for the Chief Inspector to produce a set of recommendations that are then implemented and then give rise to raises in efficiency, effectiveness and consistency. That's what we're all here to do, to get that increase in there. If recommendations are not implemented or not accepted, it implies something has gone not quite right within the process. I always made it a goal when I've led previous reviews to discuss with the people you're reviewing the emerging recommendations so that you could craft them in a way that when it came to it, you had a set of recommendations that ideally were all accepted and could all be implemented because they had been talked through and you had got the assurance from the other side, yes, this looks like a sensible recommendation, we can implement it. Or if one was pursuing a recommendation that the other side, as it were, was saying, look, no, this one feels very difficult for whatever reason. Is there any scope for reshaping the recommendation in a way that can achieve the same outcome and the same aim, but in a way that makes it better for them? So I think recommendations that are not accepted or only partially accepted, they raise the question, what has gone what has happened before then that gives rise to that situation? Have they been discussed between the inspectors and the other party? Because at the end of the day, for me, an inspection has to be done with the people. You have to do it with the people to get the best possible outcome. If you do it unto them and lay down a set of recommendations which haven't been checked out for their implementability, if that's the right word, or their appropriateness within the context, the danger is you get pushback, you don't get the recommendations being owned, and then nothing moves forward.
But wouldn't that just be allowing them to help you mark their homework?
No, and this is where the independence, to come back to Mr. Murray's comment, this is where, as an independent chief inspector, one's integrity says, no, I'm not going to be pushed around to just write recommendations, as it were, that the other side or the body wants to achieve. This is where I have to stand up and say, no, there needs to be something more robust than what you might just want yourself.
So how would you go about holding the Home Office to account in that situation?
Or for what?
For not implementing certain recommendations you put forward. What actions, because you've talked about what you wouldn't do, but what actions would you take?
Well, again, it would be, I think, a similar answer to the question which came from Mr. Mora. You'd escalate it up through the various levels to find out what's going on. And the key then is why. Why are recommendations not being accepted? Why are they not being implemented? Now, I know only too well from having been a chief executive, when I've been inspected and reviewed, you get a whole raft of recommendations and you think, oh my goodness, everyone's working flat out on the business as usual and I've now got 10 additional recommendations I'm meant to implement. Sometimes there is that dimension to the thing, that people are already so busy that actually to implement other recommendations is very, very challenging. So I think there's something about understanding why recommendations are not implemented. There may also be disagreements with the recommendations, but in a good inspection, you would have bottomed that out earlier.
And how would you look to secure evidence as to whether or not the efficiency and effectiveness of border and immigration systems have improved as a result of implementing the ICIBI's recommendations?
It comes back to measuring the effectiveness and efficiency of a process that you may be looking at or a function that you're looking at, and establishing a baseline before you start and seeing what that baseline is. And then ideally, once your recommendations have been made, can you measure whether that baseline parameter, whatever performance indicator it is, has actually improved. Now that will take time, inevitably, but that's the way to come to a conclusion at the end of the day, whether efficiency and effectiveness has improved.
Thank you. Chris?
Just very quickly follow up on that. If you want to work with the Home Office in advance of publishing your recommendations for their implementability to ensure that they are all implemented, isn't the risk that the Home Office will only agree to things that they were already going to do anyway? How are you ever going to push the Home Office to do anything transformational if they're going to sign off and probably give you things they were already planning to do?
This is where you have to have an escalation route, and that's where I would raise it up to the DG level and saying, look, you have a process here within your function here within your remit. I'm saying to you as a chief inspector, this is where it ought to be improved. This is it. Now, again...
Well, I keep that conversation internal because if you publish it, we can see, and then we can, the rest of it, public society, our constituents can hold us to account for it not happening. A conversation between you and a DG isn't the most robust way of ensuring the Home Office changes, surely, given the huge sort of ecosystem that exists around the Home Office.
I sincerely hope that we're all on the same side and we're all actually looking for the same thing. And that myself,
this is politics.
Sorry, perhaps that was a naive response. But in terms of improving efficiency and effectiveness, I would hope that myself, Home Secretary, Ministers, Permanent Secretaries and the DGs, we're all on the same side. We want to improve the systems. We know that there are areas where they're not optimal. We want to identify those areas and get them up as much as we possibly can.
I understand the point about all working towards the same broad objectives, but what if the obstacle is competence? What if the obstacle is the Home Office isn't competently achieving it rather than it's not that the willingness isn't there; it's the capacity.
Well, when I approach an inspection or a review, I adopt a methodology which looks at whatever the scale, the size, it's the same methodology. It looks at the issue, the function through 6 lenses. You look first of all at what is this function trying to achieve? And how will you know whether this function has been successful? Are there critical success factors? The second thing you look at is you look at the governance and you look at the decision making. Is there a clear line of accountability and responsibility for delivering this function? The third thing you look at is what's important. Have priorities been established within this function that provide a framework for people to actually make the right decision, the appropriate decision, if, for example, it's an asylum or a visa application or something like that? Are priorities laid down? And go back to what we were talking about much earlier about, for example, migrants' rights. Is migrants' rights actually laid down as a key priority for this particular function? You also in that look at assumptions as well, what assumptions are being made, because it's all answering the question, what is important? The fourth area you look at is the resources, the people, the skills, the money that the function has available to it. Has it got enough people with the right skills? Come back to your competence level. Then you look at the actual process itself. Is the process well defined? Do people know what they're meant to be achieving? Are they being line managed in a competent way for them to deliver the daily outcomes which are actually delivering your top level aim? And then finally, you look at stakeholders, you look at the external environment, you look at end users, you look at their experiences, and you understand what their views are. And you might also look, if necessary, at IT systems supporting the business processes. Now, you look at those 6 levels, and I have found, and I've used this model for 25 years now, actually, if you apply it rigorously, you very quickly start seeing which of the levels is the one that you think, we've got an issue here.
Yeah.
And
if it's competence,
yes,
not willingness, why do you maintain the conversation at Director General yourself level and not go public?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
So the discussion was about whether or not you would ever go public, and you're saying no, you would want to escalate it. You said use the example of a Director General, and I said, what if you found they weren't competent to implement your recommendations? Would you still keep the recommendation in a report and go public with it, or would you keep it out?
I can't publish a report. The Home Secretary publishes the reports. So I would put in a report if I felt that competence was an issue and that skills training was missing in this particular function. I'd certainly put that into a report, but I can't publish it.
O'Connor.
I'd like to briefly go back to my previous line of questioning. I am right, aren't I, that you worked with the Archbishop of York between 2011 and 2014, the end of 2014?
It's about that period, yes.
That's right. Whilst you clearly weren't there when the safeguarding review occurred, you were there when the safeguarding failures that were the subject of the review occurred. Were you aware of any of those safeguarding failures?
Never.
The letter of June 2013 from the victim, you had nothing to do in answering that?
Nothing to do with my work at all.
Should you have been aware?
I think if there had been a major safeguarding issue within one of the 3 dioceses, which I was working with, which were Ripon and Leeds, Bradford and Wakefield, I would have been aware of it. But I was not aware of any such letter.
Safeguarding failures by your boss, that's something you shouldn't have been aware of?
My boss was the Archbishop of York at the time, but he had a huge amount of agenda that I was totally unaware of. I was only one small microcosm of his totality of his work.
So, reading the review, you've not reflected at all on what you might have done in that period?
All I can say to this committee is I was never aware of any issues of that nature during the time I worked with the Archbishop.
No, I'm asking you, should you have been, or should you have reflected on, once those failures were made public knowledge in the review, should you have reflected perhaps on whether in your role you should have been aware? Have you gone through that process? Have you thought about that?
What we did remember discussing was, as you brought 3 dioceses together, how the safeguarding issues of 3 separate organisations would be handled within one larger organisation. There was discussion of that, but nothing, I'm afraid.
I'm just asking whether you've reflected in the light of the review. But you're saying you haven't reflected in the light of the review. Okay, thank you. You've described the role as being perceived as something of a toothless tiger. How are you going to address, presumably you don't want it to be a toothless tiger, how are you going to address that perception?
I think that was the perception as of probably about a year ago, when there was quite a hiatus going on. I think things have stabilised to a degree now, and I think the current Chief Inspector has brought a degree of stability to it. But I certainly don't want to be a toothless tiger. I certainly want to issue reports which are accurate, evidence-based, have good recommendations that will bring around the results we all want: efficiency, effectiveness and consistency. Yes, I want them to be, I don't want them to be hard-hitting for the sake of being hard-hitting. I want them to be good in the sense of having good implementable recommendations that will make a difference at the end of the day. That's what I'm after.
Do you see yourself having a sort of media role in publicising what you're doing?
I think given the level of concern that I mentioned right at the outset about the public about immigration, for the Chief Inspector to have no, as it were, media-type presence or profile seems unusual. In the past, as I mentioned earlier, I have always, in all my roles where there's been a media element, tried to develop linkages with the media such that as and when, if things did go, as it were, wrong or there was an issue, one had an understanding of the media, how they worked and they of you, that I always found worked in your favour rather than if you were doing it with no such understanding. So yes, I would see the Chief Inspector needing to have some form of a media profile. Just what that is and how it manifests itself, I've yet to work through with the staff as to how we would do it.
You feel you have enough media experience to do that?
Oh yes, I've done that.
Okay. You're very accepting of the limits of the role, the fact that you can't publish. Your predecessor, but one, said there should be a review of the limits, there should be a push for the right to publish. Do you think there should be a review, or are you accepting of the limits of your role?
No, I would agree with my predecessor, but one who's sitting behind me at the moment. I think there are some anomalies with the Chief Inspector role as it's set up at the moment, and I think as I understand it, if the Windrush recommendations are being revisited, and there may be an intention to do some kind of review of the role and remit, I would welcome that, because I think there are areas which would need to be explored. What I've tried to articulate to this committee is what I see the framework, which it is at the moment, which is not necessarily the framework that might be the most appropriate framework moving forward. So I would welcome a review. I think it's probably timely, and that can look at all kinds of things, whether it's publishing reports, also size, resources, and other issues.
And you've not previously suggested that a review would detract from the work of the office?
Reviews, in my experience, can impact on an office, particularly when it's a very small office. And if you find a review is asking for loads of detail about how the office works, what it's done here, what it's done there, you find your staff are then chasing around trying to find data to feed the beast of the review rather than getting on with their work. That's been my experience in the past, and it is a risk.
And have you expressed that in consideration of a review here? Have you said it might detract from our work?
Well, I'm not in the role yet, so I can't, and I'm not in a position yet to influence but my understanding is a review is under consideration, and if I were in the role, then I would be saying, right, how are we going to do this in a way that has minimum impact on the core work of the staff within the inspectorate?
Have you suggested it might detract from the work? Have you suggested that?
No, because I haven't had those discussions yet with the Home Office.
What do you see as the anomalies with the role at the moment?
I think a lot of them were articulated in the NAO report, which is 10 years ago, but I think they are still extant. The setup for the Chief Inspector of Prisons and Fire and Constabulary and Borders and Immigration are slightly different. There is the funding issue, there is the report publications issue, there is redaction issues. There are differences between what are fundamentally, they're doing fundamentally the same kind of job in a different context. Now, where I think there is also scope for definite improvement is the learning lessons between the various inspectorates. The Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration overlaps, particularly with the Inspector of Prisons and with the Inspector of Constabulary, and there are all kinds of overlap issues which I think perhaps need looking at and addressing, let alone overlap issues with other government departments as well. So you asked me what were the other areas that are anomalies. One is I think we have to look at the remit of the Chief Inspector within other government departments, because at the moment that remit doesn't exist, but so many issues do go across other government departments, and how that gets addressed in the future. There's issues like access to contractual details. So there are a number of anomalies.
I mean, all these roles have been set up at different points when there's been usually because there's been a new piece of legislation and there's therefore an opportunity to put an inspector role in or commissioner role, or possibly because there's been a public outrage about something and it's a good position for a minister and to put somebody independent in so that they can give the public confidence. How are you going to make sure the public do have confidence in the borders and our immigration system?
Well, for one person to bring around a complete change in public perceptions of borders and immigration, I think is even beyond the independent chief inspector. Public opinion, I think, is largely swayed by the media coverage. And I think it's how one interacts with the media, and that's why I think it's so important that the chief inspector going forward does have some form of a media contact and profile to be able to influence if possible. Now, of course, this comes with risks. As soon as you expose your head to the media, you expose yourselves to challenge, questions, embarrassing or others, but that's a risk we all take. And my view would be is that there is a degree of public accountability in this role. It's a sort of informal accountability. It's not an accountability that's laid down in letters or whatever. But I think, to go back to your question, Mr. Murray, about what the public expect, public have expectations of this role, and I think it's right that this role should, as far as possible and sensible, meet those expectations, keep the public informed through perhaps appropriate media contact, so that one can hopefully start turning the dial.
Chris Murray, and then I'll bring Bell in.
Can I ask a final question about stakeholders? Who do you think, if you in the first 6 months to a year of being in post, who would you identify as the key stakeholders for the Chief Inspector, and how would you go about building those relationships?
If I can answer the second question first, I'd go out and visit them, go out and meet them face to face. Face to face, not on Teams, unless Teams is absolutely necessary. Go out and meet them face to face, and then let them get the measure of you. I build credibility with them, and I start understanding where they are coming from and what their rationale is. The challenge here is that the stakeholder list is huge.
I'm sorry, just to be clear, I mean outside the Home Office.
Yes, I was going to say outside of the Home Office. Well, I mean the first. I can start running down the list if you like.
Let's go in order of importance. I
think end users and their representative bodies are absolutely critical here, because all these borders and immigration services are there for an end user to experience in some shape or form. So finding the views of the representative bodies, the various refugee groups, the migration groups, is a very, very important business. There is then all the other agencies involved with the illegal migration, because that is a top priority for this government, understanding how that is going and where a chief inspector can add value, inspect along with other agencies as well. You have, as well as that, all the various local authorities and other government departments who have impact upon the various functions that we've talked about. There are, I'm not sure that I'm getting them in an exact order of priority here, but there are the ports, the airlines, the airports and the port authorities, all of whom are actually on a day-to-day basis managing the border and what actually happens at the border. You've got the other inspectors, goodness knows how many there are of which we've mentioned already, you know, the other chief inspectors. You've got the other inspecting bodies like the National Audit Office, the Infrastructure Projects Authority, Government Internal Audit, all of whom are carrying out reviews and inspections which potentially overlap with those of the ICIBI. So there's a question of ensuring that we're getting cohesion, we're not duplicating, and we're not stepping on each other's toes, as it were.
Okay, thank you for that. And it's interesting to me that the two sort of groups that were absent from that list were, first of all, anyone political. So number 10, the Home Affairs Select Committee, the House of Commons, not mentioned on that. Also, anyone media or representing the public. So that could also be the wider press, or trade unions or anything like that. So was that a deliberate omission?
No. I was trying to flick through my notes because I had a list as long as your list and I couldn't remember all 15 of them. But undoubtedly, Parliament, this committee, is representative of Parliament and also representative of your constituencies, and the views has fed through to you. That is a vital stakeholder who must be engaged with.
What would you do if there was tensions between those stakeholders?
And if I can just add to that often in this area there is a lot of lobby groups, there's an awful lot of organisations. They don't all have common cause. Some have different agendas and different reasons for the work they're doing. How do you manage that? Which I think links to Chris's question.
That was my question, exactly.
It's a question of, I agree with you totally, they all come with different agendas, they will all have different expectations, and we go back to the issue, the expectation of independence, and what independence means to one group can mean a totally different thing to another group. The way I would tackle this is try to get to each of these groups as quickly as I could. There would have to be some form of prioritisation. I'm not quite sure what priorities would come straight first, but we'll come to that one later. To understand what their expectations are, what their main concerns are, because their concerns are a main feeder into driving a programme of inspections. I mean, an inspection programme should be driven by the concern of ministers, the concern of the DGs about the functions who are delivering the services, and then the end user concerns through their representative bodies or any of this mass of stakeholders. So it's a question of getting to them, understanding what their concerns are, what they expect of the ICIBI, and how far I can deliver on that expectation or not, as the case may be, but being explicit about that, and then taking it forward after that.
Anyone wants to come in?
And following on from that, I suppose whose expectations are the most important? In other commissioner and independent inspector roles, one of the things that's very clear is that there's meant to be scrutiny. And I know obviously you are appointed by the government, but I suppose who in your view do you work for? Who's the key stakeholder? Whose views matter the most?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very good question, if I may say so. And it's not one that I think there's an immediate answer to. In one sense, yes, this is a public appointment. There is the framework that I mentioned before within the Home Office ensures that the Home Office pays the salary, if you like. There is, I can be sacked, or the role can be sacked by the Home Office, by the Home Secretary. But in terms of, there isn't that formal accountability to a set of objectives that you would normally have within just about any other role that I've ever worked in, where you have a defined hierarchy of accountability, responsibility and authority. This sits independent. So the question is, who is, if your question was who is the most influential, they're all influential.
Equally?
No, it depends on the context. Depends on the context. And it would depend on whether I was formulating a program or if I was looking at a particular issue, a particular function, a particular area of work, as to which stakeholder really has, as it were, the impact and influence in that area. It will vary, and it won't stay the same.
Thank you.
We were almost at the end, so I know we've kept you quite a long time, and we did have the break for the vote. But you've got all these different stakeholders, you've got all these different organisations with different agendas, and they're going to criticise you. If you have some, if they come to you with some criticism of what's going on at the board, as treatment of migrants or a gap in the system, and you take this to the DG and you escalate it up, but nothing further happens, and they go public to criticise you, what do you do at that point?
Take a very deep breath, not take it personally, though it probably would be aimed personally, and you have to acknowledge that the criticism is probably at the role rather than at the person as a person. No one particularly likes criticism, and in this area, yes, criticism can get quite vitriolic, quite nasty. Equally, that's something I've experienced before. When we were running a health authority, we had in our area a child was murdered, and murdered by someone who had been receiving mental health services from within the health authority's area. The public were holding us, the health authority, and me as the chief executive, as responsible for the murder of the child. And it got very personal. All one can do then is hunker down, rely on one's colleagues, recognise it's the role rather than you, the individual, and then manage it as best you can.
I mean, as a minister, you can hide behind collective responsibility. You're not governed by collective responsibility.
No. I'm quite ready for that. I understand that. I recognise it. It's part of the turf, if you like. It's part of the job. I'm quite happy to do that.
Maybe ministers don't hide behind collective responsibility. They're just governed by collective responsibility. Can I thank you for giving your time today? As I say, we have kept you for a very long session, and I apologise for the break in the middle of it, or right at the beginning of it for the vote. But thank you very much, and we will now meet in private to discuss conclusions. But order.